A series of droughts across the Horn of Africa have left a lot of people asking about the connections between climate change, drought, and the displacement that drought then causes. Now, this is actually a situation that's got a lot of different forces at play, and for those of you who are familiar with our videos, the answer to this question will usually be that the whole situation is much more complicated than first meets the eye. But what we're going to try and do in this video, short as it is unpack this relationship. How are climate change, drought, famine and displacement connected? And specifically, how are those connections playing out at the moment in the Horn of Africa? The first thing that I want to look at is the relationship between climate change and drought. And this is something around which there is an emerging scientific consensus. It does seem to be the case that increased global temperatures do lead to the severity of droughts increasing and the length of droughts increasing. Now, in some ways this is quite an intuitive answer. Of course, a hotter planet might mean longer periods of hot weather and longer periods without rainfall. And it does seem to be that the scientific consensus supports this intuition. A hotter planet is likely to be one with more prolonged and more severe droughts. And it does seem to be that in the Horn of Africa this is already happening. The global warming that we've already seen does seem to be making the droughts in that region more severe and more prolonged. But this is where it begins to get more complicated. There isn't a direct, simple relationship between a drought and migration, or between a drought and displacement. And especially in the Horn of Africa, there are other forces at play here. One way of looking at this is to think about other places across the world that have also experienced drought, but unlike the Horn of Africa, have not experienced huge-scale migration and displacement. There has, for example, been a prolonged drought in California, but unlike in the Horn of Africa, this hasn't led to widespread migration and displacement. And the simple reason for this difference is wealth. Essentially, California is one of the most wealthy regions on the planet, and this wealth has insulated that region to some extent against the impacts of drought. The other force at play is the number of people who are engaged in agriculture as their main form of livelihood. Now, in California, the number of people who are engaged in farming is significant, but it is by no means the main employer. That's not so much the case in the Horn of Africa, obviously, and what that means is that when drought impacts rural livelihoods, you get much more migration and displacement in places that have large numbers of people engaged in agriculture as their primary livelihood. The other key question that's been asked is about the relationship between drought, famine, and conflict. And this is a really complicated collection of issues, and the relationship between them is not simple. It is the case that drought can lead to famine, but it would be a mistake to think that drought inevitably leads to famine. It is often the case that with help from other countries or with swift government action, a drought doesn't have to turn into a famine. Just because there's a drought doesn't mean that people have to go hungry. With the right kind of support and the right kind of intervention, this can often be stopped. Another question that's been posed is this: is there a relationship between famine and conflict? Specifically, has the shortage of food left people in a position where they feel like they have to fight each other for the food that's left? So many people have drawn a connection between climate change, drought, famine, and then armed conflict. Now, what I want to do is present what I hope is a slightly more nuanced way of looking at this. If we accept that drought doesn't have to turn into famine, we can then ask the question, well, does drought have to lead to famine and then armed conflict? And I think the answer there is no. But that does leave us with the question, well, why is it that these things, especially in the Horn of Africa, seem to co-occur? Why is it that there is widespread drought and also widespread conflict, and is there a connection there? I think a more sensible way of looking at it, though, is to say that conflict is one of the forces that has prevented governments or other agencies intervening to stop a drought turning into a famine. So we haven't got a kind of simple linear progression here from climate change, drought, famine and conflict. What we've actually got is pre-existing armed conflicts, which then when combined with drought, prevent governments, aid agencies and NGOs assisting in a way that stops that drought turning into a famine. So what you then have is these incredible and tragic co-occurrences where you have drought, famine and conflict all happening at the same time, which makes each of those problems even worse and even harder to solve. Although the situation in the Horn of Africa can seem intractable, this analysis does lead us to the kind of answers, the kind of solutions that might be of some assistance. What this points to is the importance of preventing and stopping conflicts. It is, after all, the presence of protracted armed violence in the Horn of Africa which has meant that many people have gone hungry. It's these conflicts that have meant that drought has turned into famine. So preventing these conflicts really lies at the heart of the wider solutions to many of the Horn of Africa's problems.